The NBA Cup might be the first big test of the season, and by the time it ends, Joe Dumars could already be deciding Willie Green's fate. And with a new assistant coach joining the staff, it's very clear that Troy Weaver's influence is shaping every move the Pelicans make. It's the Wednesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Wednesday, we got a lot to cover in today's show. I'm going to explain why the NBA Cup is key for the Pelicans, and more importantly, Willie Green's future with the team. This might be decided by December, mid-December. I'll explain why. Plus, I want to look at the Pelicans hiring Mike Hopkins to be an assistant coach. Less about Hopkins and more about connections that he has to the organization here. Then I'm going to answer a listener question of if Herb Jones could make an all-star team this year. So we got a lot to cover in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the number one Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. And don't forget, you can also watch the Locked On Pelicans podcast on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network every single weekday at 10:30 a.m., the same place you watch your Pelicans play. So let's get into this. Most of these today's show, two of the questions are actually inspired by Twitter questions when I put the call out for theirs. So this one comes from @Mark A. Rudd, and he says, by the time the NBA Cup wraps up in mid-December, will Joe Dumars have seen enough to judge Willie Green as the head coach? And I think this is a great question because there are a couple of key dates for this team. And how I'm going to answer this question is going to piggyback off of yesterday's show. So if you haven't listened to that already about the Pelicans not being directionless, they just haven't chosen which direction they want to go down just yet. To me, that's different than being directionless. It ties into picking the path of being competitive or going for development / a rebuild, right? So look, the NBA Cup is a true test for this team. It's a very good benchmark. Teams take the NBA Cup seriously. It might seem gimmicky, but teams actually want to win this. The players get up for it. So you have group play from October 31st to November 28th, with each team playing 4 games. That's a good test. Those 4 games I do think are a good benchmark when it comes to, are you competitive? Where are you here? And so if the Pelicans are healthy but not winning, or they get eliminated from the NBA Cup, they don't make it out of the group play stage, I think they have to make a change, because this is a team that needs to try and make the playoffs first and foremost. And then should that not work, you can pivot to development. But given you don't own your first round pick next year, you may as well try and be competitive and make the postseason in some capacity. So if your team is not winning or you don't get out of group play, there's something wrong there. That means you're not as competitive with some of the other teams. And so you need to make a change to try and see if you've got something here with this roster, because they believe in themselves here. I was just on Locked On Fantasy Basketball literally yesterday saying the Pelicans believe in themselves. So if all of a sudden they start losing games, you need to make a change to get more out of your roster and this team. Since you can't turn over the roster in mid-December, the NBA Cup ends December 16th. That's when the championship game is. The easiest thing becomes changing of a head coach, right? I've talked about this. The everydayers know this. There's, to me, like an order of operations, a way you triage a bad season. First and foremost is you fire your head coach and you bring in a different head coach, because that's easier to do than changing over the roster in the middle of a year. So if they fail to get out of group play, so we're looking like November 28th, the Pelicans probably need to make a change. And that likely means they elevate James Borrego to being the associate head coach. And it's important to do this then. Say by December 16th, right? Or even by November 28th, because of the next key date that I'm going to talk to you about. And that's the February 6th trade deadline. But let's go back to mid-December here. Since the NBA Cup is competitive, it is that true test. So the reason you make a change at head coach is because it's too early to pivot to that development track. You can't just play Jeremiah Fears a ton of minutes, Derek Queen a ton of minutes, and be like, that's what our focus is on this season in December 1st, mid-December. It's just too early to do that. Partially because if you want to switch to development, you need to trade off other guys that are potentially in the way of those players. You need to open minutes up for them. If Derek Queen is your guy for the future and you want to pivot to development, the fit between him and Zion doesn't make the most sense on the court. So you can't play him and Zion. You might need to trade Zion. But no one is making big-time trades or selling off pieces in December and January. You just don't really get buyers yet until you get closer to the NBA's trade deadline. So what this essentially does is it gives you two chances at being competitive and being good. The first month or two under head coach Willie Green, and if that doesn't work, you move on to James Borrego and see if he can elevate the team. And it also basically gives him 2 months to try and salvage the year and audition for the job full time. Now, say you make that change, call it December 1st, right? You get eliminated from the NBA Cup, out of the group stage. You're not going into the knockout rounds, which goes one game at home for the higher seed. Then you go to Vegas for the semifinals and the finals. So the quarterfinals are played in NBA arenas. If that's the case, you give him a little bit of time to just try and prove himself, which I think is a smart thing to try and do. So you have two chances, two cracks at being competitive, one under Willie Green and one under the interim coach. And then if that doesn't work, you make the changes you need to make at the trade deadline in February, on February 6th. So you'd likely start selling off pieces around like late January here. So you've got to make this move on the earlier side if you're going to relieve head coach Willie Green of his duties because, you want to give James Borrego a fair enough chance. And if you've elevated Borrego to the interim and then you've traded everyone away at the trade deadline, he's not going to look good, right? They're just aren't going to, you're not going to be competitive at that point in time. So you want to give him at least a chance to succeed rather than firing Willie Green at the trade deadline, trading away Zion, and then elevating Borrego to the interim job and being like, good luck, buddy. He's not going to win, right? Like that's a mess of a situation to throw somebody into. I mean, someone's got to do it and someone will take that interim tag. Don't get me wrong. But at that point, how do you even, evaluate James Borrego post that or whoever would be the interim? And you would be evaluating that person potentially to be your head coach of the future. So that's why I think this question was particularly great, in my opinion, because it does focus on those kind of key dates, right? Somewhere between November 28th and December 16th, and then the February 6th trade deadline. And you can kind of start to see the stages that the Pelicans could go through. They, again, have multiple paths available to them, and then they can choose at the appropriate time when to go down said path. And this gives you the best ways of kind of staggering those deadlines, in my opinion, to go about and do it. So the early part of this coming season is going to be really important, right? Look, maybe the worst case scenario is you're kind of forced to stay the middle. And we talked yesterday about how they're kind of in a two timelines era and it means you can't commit to one or the other, which means you kind of, do both of them half whatever, right? And that's not a great situation to be in. So say the Pelicans get out of the NBA Cup group stages and lose in the quarterfinals, don't make it to Vegas. That I think then makes things a little bit muddied, but I think we'll kind of know. I think this is a team that you're going to kind of know where they are early on in the year. And then if injuries derail it, and you're going to need to pivot anyway. And that becomes a natural path. So the NBA Cup, I do think, is going to be an important benchmark for this team to really see where they stand, because those are going to be some of the more competitive games that they play this coming season. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below. But that's the way I would play it out if I were the Pelicans going into this season right now. Do you think Willie Green survives? Do you think they make a move then? Do you think they keep him the whole year and then just boot him towards the end? Let me know what you think in the comments down below on YouTube. So coming up next, they got a new assistant coach here in New Orleans, but is it a questionable hire? I'll explain. That's coming up next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Game Time. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends and family? Maybe it's game day and you just suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. So that's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. So with the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Game Time makes it possible. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple, and prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch. And they've got incredible last minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Went to Dodger Stadium a couple of weeks ago, just decided to hop in the car with the fiance, drive out there and go. We got our tickets on the Game Time app as we were en route to the stadium and got a great deal because of the last minute prices. It's the best way to do this, in my opinion, here. And I also love the seat views in the app. If you're going to a venue you've never been to before, you know exactly where you're going to be and you get the exact sight lines that you want. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well, almost 12,000. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. For your second listen today, it is game week for the New Orleans Saints. Who's going to be QB1 for the Saints as they have their first preseason game with the Chargers here coming right up? Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints is breaking down the QB battle for you, giving you the inside scoop on who's going to be getting the reps in an actual game. Make Locked On Saints your second listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So the news broke in, honestly, a bit of a weird way to me, that the Pelicans are hiring Mike Hopkins as an assistant coach who's going to have a focus on player development here. Hopkins previously last year was an assistant coach with the Phoenix Suns. Prior to that, he was a head coach at the University of Washington for 7 years, and then a longtime assistant and player with Syracuse. The news broke from Pete Thamel of ESPN. He's a college football guy, and I don't know, that seemed a little weird to me. Some of the stuff coming out from the team has been a little bit odd how they're deciding to do it here. So last year he was with the Suns. Before that, the University of Washington. He had a record of 118-106. Early on in his tenure at Washington, UW, in the Pac-12, he was good. He was the Pac-12 Coach of the Year twice in a row, but the success started to temper off. But he's most known for his time at Syracuse, which is what I think is the most interesting part about this hire. I'm going to get into some more of the credentials here in a second. But would you believe there's a Troy Weaver connection to Mike Hopkins here? Hopkins played at Syracuse and then was an assistant coach there for 22 years, from 95 to 2017. But it's the 2000 to 2004 period which really jumps out to me. During that time, Troy Weaver was an assistant coach at Syracuse as well. So this continues the trend of moves the Pelicans are making, players, other things, right, around the team that have a direct connection to Troy Weaver. Guys he's drafted, guys he was on a team with, or guys with, ties to the DMV area, whatever it might be. There are connections to Troy Weaver. And while, look, I don't hate this hire. I can't really accurately grade whether Mike Hopkins is going to be good or bad. And we'll focus on his credentials in a minute here. But look, given the way this offseason has played out for New Orleans, and while Joe Dumars is the man in charge, I'm not saying Troy Weaver is like secretly running the team or a shadow GM or anything, like none of that, right? They all consult. I get how this works. I've talked with people around the team. I get what's going on there. It's all a collaboration, but you can definitely see that Troy Weaver has a very outsized impact on the team, and people have been kind of raking the team over the coals for it, right? There's not a good perception around the franchise right now. There's no getting around that. I tend to be more optimistic around the team and positive, but if you talk to people, look, go watch Locked On Fantasy Basketball that I was on the other day, and Josh Lloyd does not feel particularly good about this team, Joe Dumars or Troy Weaver, and some of the moves that they've made, partially because those moves are really heavily connected to Troy Weaver. He was even making jokes, calling basically Troy Weaver a shadow GM of the team, and that like Joe Dumars doesn't matter here because it's Troy Weaver pulling the strings and doing everything. That's a little bit overblown. He was more making it as a joke than anything else, but that's the perception of the team right now. And so this hire, which again is truly impossible to judge, this hire, even if it's good, falls into that negative perception. It looks lazy. And one of the things the everydayers heard me do this show, the Pelicans need to change the perception around the team. Truthfully, that might mean making some moves, making some changes just to make changes without necessarily some intent behind them. And while I don't love that, the team needs to do something to shake the reputation that they have. Mike Hopkins might be a great coach, might really develop players here, and they could use that. But it's until you get the results of that 3-4 years down the line, the perception is not going to be particularly great, right? That's immediately what it is. Rather than kind of looking at this hire and doing some of the research, which I did, and I'll tell you, like all the NBA players he's worked with in college and all of that stuff, right? Rather than all of that, it's immediately, hey, he has a connection to Troy Weaver, and it just overshadows everything, right? It's a perception thing. And what ultimately matters is like the wins and losses on the court. The perception does matter too, and this team does not have a good perception, right? At this point, the Pelicans just feel so predictable. Here's the thing. That can kill you in trade negotiations. That could kill you in free agency discussions in trying to get a good salary on a player or get him a little bit lower. That's not ideal here, right? How much of that was at play when the Atlanta Hawks were trying to broker a deal with New Orleans for that 13th overall pick, knowing they desperately wanted Derek Queen? And were they just on the phone being like, well, we're going to draft Derek Queen unless you make the pick unprotected or something like that? Did that harm them in negotiations? And the answer might be yes. Zach Lowe was on his show saying like, I don't think it's quite that, but there is some degree of that, I think, at play here. And so making these moves that are just so predictable, everyone predicted Micah Peavy in the second round, everyone, because he was at Georgetown, right? That shows Troy Weaver's fingerprints literally on everything right now including the coaching staff too. Let's leave that be for a minute. Let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. Look, there's going to be Detroit Pistons fans probably in the comments kind of laughing, being like, we told you so with this sort of thing. Let's go back to Mike Hopkins and ignore the connection to Troy Weaver here for a little bit, right? At Syracuse from 95 to 2017, I did as much research as I was going to dive into on this one. I counted 13 NBA players that played in NBA regular season games. So that doesn't count guys that were drafted or undrafted that made a training camp roster and then maybe played in Europe. This is guys who played at least one regular season NBA game, 13 guys over that 22-year period, which, by the way, I think is pretty good. Right? Hakeem Warwick had a very good career in the NBA. Carmelo Anthony was there too, obviously, right? Wesley Johnson was on New Orleans at one point, and he's there. You've got Johnny Flynn. You have Fab Melo, Dion Waiters, Michael Calder-Williams, Jeremy Grant. There's a good amount of names there that, really were in the NBA and doing these sorts of things. So that track record is pretty good for guys to have played at least one game in the NBA and developing those guys. At Washington, he had 3 first-round picks there from 2017 to 2024 when Washington isn't exactly known as an NBA factory. Matisse Thybulle, Jaden McDaniels, Isaiah Stewart. Then you also have Jalen Noel, who was on the Pelicans, who wasn't a first-round pick but was drafted, right? That's 4 more players kind of that he's been involved with in some capacity that is having some NBA success. And I think that gets us up to like 17 total names here of guys who have played at least one NBA game. That's a pretty good track record, truthfully. Having that type of guy that coming from college, especially in the area that he did, which was not quite the one and done era, or where we are right now, where you did work with some of these guys to develop and, be there. I kind of love that, truthfully. he's done a lot of development with these guys. So that's encouraging for them to bring him in. It's overshadowed by the Troy Weaver connection. But this is one of those things that, there's no reason to actually complain about this hire beyond that Troy Weaver connection. So I think he could do a good job working with the team. He's got some NBA experience now. I like that. It was a mess there with the Phoenix Suns last season. So whatever. So I think this could be a good move. They're shaking up the coaching staff just a little bit here. They've lost some people. They're working on adding some more onto it, I'm sure. And this is someone who's not going to be likely a front of bench coach. This is going to be a guy who's on the second row that's working with these players on an individual basis and really doing the best that he can to kind of bring them along. So, this is a hire that could be quite good. It's just, we could have probably seen something like this coming. What do you think about the Mike Hopkins hire? Do you just say, nope, don't like it because of the Troy Weaver connection? Do you think he could do a good job? Are you open-minded about it? Let me know in the comments down below, because look, the track record he has of getting guys into the NBA and working with those guys to develop their skills, that's more important, truthfully, than anything else. And that's what's going to make or break this hire when we eventually look back on it, with hindsight here. And given what he's done, I think this has potential to be just like a good addition to the team, kind of as simple as that. So coming up next, does Herb Jones get his first All-Star nod this year? I'm going to give you the answer that's coming up next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by OpenPhone. If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. So think about the last time you had an urgent need. Plumber, maybe a mechanic, something like that. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait? No, you moved on, right? That's why you need OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. OpenPhone is going to let you manage business calls and texts from a single app, and they've got a shared inbox, which is a game-changing feature. Your team can jump into any conversation instantly without missing a beat. And an AI agent can handle after-hours calls, answer common questions, and capture leads so you never miss a customer. OpenPhone is offering Locked On Pelicans listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. That's OpenPhone.com/LockedOnNBA. And if you have an existing number with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone, no missed calls, no miss customers. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this team. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Watch us on YouTube as well. Comment down below on YouTube and become an everydayer. And don't forget, you can watch us on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network every single weekday at 10:30 a.m. For your second listen, it's Locked On Fantasy Basketball. I was just on there with host Josh Lloyd, literally the GOAT of fantasy basketball, like ever, mean that. Covering all things Pelicans. He asked questions, I answered, we discussed them all. Go give that a watch. It's going to give you another perspective, and I trust Josh's. Make Locked On Fantasy Basketball your second listen today, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I've gone a little bit long on the show, so we got to do this kind of quickly here, and I'll make it real quick. And then I'll give you a couple of reasons why here. A reader question, and it comes from @SincereMirage on Twitter. Does Herb get his first All-Star nod this year? This one's simple. No, he doesn't. Look, truthfully, I love Herb Jones. I don't think he's ever going to become an all-star. The offense just isn't there. We know the defense is elite. I've got no concerns about that, but you need the offense too. And there's two players that we can look at to kind of give us like a historical perspective on this, right? The first is Tony Allen, the grind father, who briefly played in New Orleans. Actually, his basketball-reference page, the picture of him is in a New Orleans jersey. This is a guy who was a 6-time all-defensive player, right? And he never was an all-star, not once. He just didn't have the offense to go through it. He was constantly in the running for Defensive Player of the Year, but he was never even close to being an all-star because the offense just wasn't there. Simple as that. The other name is one you're going to be more familiar with. That's Dyson Daniels, right? Look at last season for him. He finished second in Defensive Player of the Year. He won Most Improved Player, and he made the All-Defensive First Team. He also averaged 14.1 points per game and shot 34%, which is a pretty significant increase from 3 that season, right? Along with 4.4 assists. The numbers are great there with the elite defense that he gave the Atlanta Hawks. And he didn't sniff the All-Star team, right? If you're runner-up in Defensive Player of the Year, win Most Improved Player, have pretty good numbers, make the all-defensive first team, and you don't even come close to making the all-star team, while you could argue whether Herb Jones is better defensively than Dyson Daniels or not, it doesn't matter. Call him even, call Herb Jones better. You need the offense to go through with it. And Herb just, look, for all the things he does and why you want him starting, why he's going to be key to this team, isn't going to have that sort of thing, right? For his career, he's averaging 10 points per game along with 2.5 assists. It's just not going to happen. He would need to shoot 42%, 45% from three on high volume. He's going to need to get close to like 17, 18 points per game with the defense that he gives you while shooting an elite percentage from three. If he does that, he can be an all-star. But I think this is the type of player that is going to be in the running for Defensive Player of the Year every single year. Will either be making first team or second team all defense. And that's kind of how it's going to be, right? I just don't see him making an all-star team unless the offense becomes very consistent and it takes not just like a slight step forward, but a pretty significant step forward too. If Dyson Daniels didn't make it while playing 76 games last season, right, it only goes through the all-star game, the numbers and everything. I just don't see it necessarily happening for Herb Jones unless we see just a massive leap in volume from three and that 3-point percentage getting back above 40%, which it was 2 years ago. The volume just wasn't there to really kind of elevate him into another level. He shot 42% from three on 3.6 attempts per game 2 years ago, right? 11 points per game, 2.6 assists, all defensive first team, fifth in defensive player of the year voting, and basically being the only non-big getting votes for that sort of thing. It was an impressive season. Wasn't going to come close to sniffing the All-Star game. Tony Allen never did it. I think Herb Jones is going to struggle unless you see a big jump in offense. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. And that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Keep the questions coming. We might answer them here on the show. And I'll be back with y'all tomorrow. See y'all next time. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Bye.